The Galactic Nexus station hung in the void like a massive spinning wheel, its outer ring rotating slowly to generate artificial gravity for the thousands of beings who called it home, at least temporarily. It was the kind of place where you could buy Threxian silk in one corridor and nearly get vaporized by a malfunctioning plasma conduit in the next. Diplomats, traders, mercenaries, and maintenance workers all rubbed shoulders here, sometimes literally, though that was generally discouraged when the species in question had acid for blood or spikes for shoulders. Lynette had worked on the station for 3 cycles now, long enough to know which species tipped well, which ones left their quarters looking like a small war had broken out, and which ones would file a formal complaint if you so much as breathed wrong near their belongings. She was a maintenance technician, which was a fancy way of saying she fixed things that broke, cleaned things that got dirty, and occasionally retrieved things that got stuck in places they absolutely should not have been able to reach. Today's assignment, the diplomatic suites on level 12, specifically the quarters assigned to the Kilmoth delegation. Oh, good. The Kilmoth were apex predators from a planet where everything, and she meant everything, wanted to kill you. They stood over 2 meters tall, covered in sleek fur that ranged from midnight black to deep amber, with retractable claws that could shred reinforced steel, and fangs that made sharks look underprepared for life. Their eyes were luminous, usually gold or green, with slit pupils that tracked movement with unnerving precision. They moved like liquid death, all coiled muscle and barely restrained violence. Most species gave them a wide berth. Most species were smart. Lynette checked her work tablet as she pushed her maintenance cart down the pristine corridor. Ambassador Ulakith and his mate Iskahana were attending the opening session of the Outer Rim Trade Summit, which meant she had a 2-hour window to perform routine maintenance, replace linens, and check the environmental controls. Simple enough. In and out, no fuss, no interstellar incidents. She keyed in her access code, and the door to the suite whispered open. The first thing that hit her was the smell, which wasn't unpleasant exactly, just different. Musky, wild, like a forest after rain mixed with something spicy she couldn't quite identify. The suite itself was impressive. 3 separate sleeping chambers branching off a large common area with floor-to-ceiling windows showing the starfield beyond. The furniture was standard-issue luxury. Low couches, a dining table, holographic entertainment system. But there were personal touches, too. Woven tapestries depicting what looked like hunting scenes, a collection of carved bone figurines on a shelf, and several large cushions scattered around that she suspected were for sleeping. And then there were the cubs. 4 of them. Lynette froze in the doorway, her hand still on the cart handle. The cubs were smaller than their parents, obviously, probably coming up to her waist if they stood on their hind legs. Their fur was fluffier, less sleek, and their proportions were almost comically off, all oversized paws and round bellies, and huge eyes that hadn't quite grown into their faces yet. They were adorable. They were also currently unsupervised, which seemed like a monumentally bad idea. The largest cub, his fur a dark charcoal gray with black stripes, sat regally on one of the cushions, watching her with intense golden eyes. That would be Zulik, if she remembered the briefing correctly. Beside him, a smaller cub with warm brown fur and curious green eyes had her nose pressed against the window, apparently fascinated by a passing maintenance drone. Oshira. The third cub, Imolok, was slate gray and looked like he was trying very hard to appear tough, while also staying very close to his siblings. And the 4th? Where was the 4th one? A tiny chirp from behind her cart answered that question. Lynette turned to find the smallest cub, Fexin, his fur a light tawny color with distinctive white paws, attempting to climb onto her cart. He'd gotten his front paws up on the lower shelf and was scrabbling ineffectively with his back legs, letting out little frustrated growls. "Oh, no you don't," Lynette muttered, gently shooing him away. "That's not a jungle gym, little guy." Fexin sat back on his haunches and chittered at her, offended. "Where's your guard?" Lynette asked, looking around the suite. There was supposed to be someone watching them. The briefing had specifically mentioned cubs. Cubs of a predatory species. Cubs who should definitely not be left alone. Her comm unit chirped. She tapped it. "Maintenance to guard station. I've got 4 unattended Kilmoth cubs in Suite 1219. What's the situation?" There was a pause, then a harried voice responded. "Emergency in the docking bay. All security personnel diverted. Can you maintain visual until relief arrives? ETA 20 minutes. Lynette looked at the cubs, who were all now staring at her with varying degrees of interest. 20 minutes? She could do 20 minutes. "Copy that," she said. "I'll keep an eye on them." She moved her cart into the suite properly, making a mental note of where each cub was positioned. Rule 1 of dealing with unpredictable life forms. Always know your exits. Rule 2. Never turn your back on something with teeth. She pulled out the large woven laundry basket from the bottom shelf of her cart. It was made from synthetic fibers, designed to be lightweight, but durable, with a broad base and handles on either side. Perfect for collecting used linens. She set it down on the floor near the entrance to the first sleeping chamber and turned to grab her scanner. That was her first mistake. The second she turned her back, she heard it. The sound of multiple small bodies in motion, the soft thump of paws on carpet, and then a collective pounce that somehow conveyed both stealth and complete lack of coordination. Lynette spun around. All 4 cubs were on the basket. Zulik had claimed the high ground, standing with his front paws on the rim, looking down at his siblings with unmistakable authority. Oshira was trying to climb inside, wiggling her hindquarters as she scrambled over the edge. Imalok circled the outside, occasionally batting at it with one paw like he was testing its structural integrity. And Fexin had somehow gotten himself completely tangled in one of the handles and was now hanging sideways, unbothered by his predicament. "That's not. I need that," Lynette said, stepping forward. Zulik's ears flattened, and he let out a tiny hiss that would have been intimidating if it hadn't been so high-pitched. She stopped. Right. Predator species. Territorial instincts. Even in children. Especially in children, actually. When they didn't have the experience to know they weren't actually a threat to a full-grown human. "Okay," Lynette said slowly, holding up her hands. "Okay, you can have the basket. For a minute." As if they'd understood her, which they almost certainly hadn't, the cubs doubled down on their claim. Oshira succeeded in tumbling into the basket, immediately curling into a ball that took up most of the space. Zulik planted himself at one end like a tiny, furry general surveying his domain. Imalok finally committed and climbed onto the rim opposite Zulik, which caused the whole basket to rock dangerously. Fexin, still tangled, started making pathetic mewling sounds until Oshira reached up and pulled him down into the basket with her. They looked so pleased with themselves. Lynette pulled out her tablet and quickly messaged her supervisor. "Minor situation in Suite 1219. Cubs have commandeered equipment. Advise." The response came back almost immediately. "Do not upset the Ambassador's offspring. Repeat, do not upset them. Stand by." Fantastic. So now she was stuck here, watching 4 alien cubs treat her laundry basket like it was the most valuable piece of real estate in the galaxy, while her supervisor presumably panicked in some office 3 levels down. Lynette sat down on the nearest couch and decided to observe. Maybe they'd get bored. Cubs got bored, right? This was just a novelty. Give it 5 minutes, and they'd move on to something else. 5 minutes later, the cubs had not moved on. In fact, they'd escalated. Zulik had begun directing his siblings with short chirps and growls, pointing with one paw toward various objects around the room. Oshira, apparently understanding perfectly, hopped out of the basket and dragged over a small cushion, which she stuffed into one side. Imlok contributed a decorative throw blanket that had been draped over the back of a chair, pulling it down with his teeth and hauling it over. Fexen, not to be outdone, attempted to steal one of the carved bone figurines from the shelf, but couldn't quite reach it, settling instead for a houseplant in a low pot that he pushed with his whole body until it bumped against the basket. They were fortifying their position. "You've got to be kidding me," Lynette said out loud. Zulik looked directly at her and made a sound that could only be described as smug. These were supposed to be the offspring of the galaxy's most fearsome warriors, the kind of species that made hardened mercenaries check their locks twice before going to sleep. And here they were, 4 fluff balls with murder mittens, building a blanket fort out of her laundry basket. Lynette felt a laugh building in her chest and had to physically bite it back. If this got out, if anyone knew that the mighty Kilmoth cubs were just as silly and playful as any other children, the ambassador would probably die of embarrassment. Or, more likely, someone else would die because the ambassador was embarrassed. She checked the time. 15 more minutes until relief arrived. She could do this. She could absolutely sit here and let them play with her basket for 15 more minutes. Zulik barked something at his siblings, and they all scrambled to obey, rearranging their fortress with serious expressions, occasionally stopping to wrestle each other when someone's tail got in someone else's face. Lynette pulled up her tablet and started documenting this for her report, because nobody was going to believe her otherwise. She made sure to angle the camera carefully, keeping the cubs in frame but making it look professional, like she was just monitoring them as requested. Definitely not recording what was possibly the most adorable interstellar incident she'd ever witnessed. Definitely not. Lynette had been in worse situations. There was that time a Quiblian trader had released a crate of bioluminescent parasites in the lower decks, or when the environmental controls in Section 9 had malfunctioned and filled 3 corridors with foam that smelled like rotting fruit. Or that memorable incident with the zero-gravity toilet that she'd rather not think about ever again. But this? Watching 4 apex predator cubs turn her laundry basket into some kind of makeshift fortress, while she waited for backup that was now, according to her latest update, delayed indefinitely? This was new territory. The cubs had moved past simple fortification and into what could only be described as urban planning. Zulik remained in command, perched on the highest point of their growing structure, which now included the basket, 2 cushions, the blanket, the potted plant, and somehow an entire side table that Lynette was certain weighed more than all 4 cubs combined. She had no idea how they'd moved it. She'd looked away for 30 seconds to check her messages, and when she looked back, there it was, incorporated into the fortress walls. Physics, apparently, was optional when you were motivated enough. Oshira was the architect, no question. She'd arranged the cushions at specific angles, creating what looked like defensive barriers. Every few minutes, she'd step back, tilt her head, make a considering noise, then rearrange something. The blanket had been draped over the top of the basket, forming a canopy. The plant, inexplicably, served as some kind of corner post. Imolok had appointed himself gate guard. He sat at what he'd clearly decided was the entrance, his posture rigid, his ears swiveling at every sound. When Lynette shifted on the couch, his eyes locked onto her with laser focus, and he made a low, rumbling sound that probably would have been threatening if it hadn't cracked halfway through into a squeak. Fexen, predictably, was chaos incarnate. He kept attempting to climb onto Zulik's head, getting swatted away, trying again, getting swatted away harder, then running circles around the entire structure before starting the process over. His attention span lasted approximately 30 seconds before something else caught his interest, which was currently one of Lynette's cleaning rags that had fallen off her cart. He pounced on it like it had personally insulted his family. Lynette made a decision. She couldn't get her basket back without causing a scene, and causing a scene with the ambassador's cubs seemed like career suicide. But she also couldn't just sit here for however long it took for someone to remember she existed. She had other suites to service, other work to do. So she'd improvise. She stood slowly, telegraphing her movements. All 4 cubs immediately focused on her, their bodies tensing. Zulik's hackles raised slightly, making him look even fluffier. "Easy," Lynette said softly. "I'm just getting some things. You can keep the basket. I'm not going to take it." She moved to her cart and pulled out a stack of towels, a few empty storage containers, and a roll of cleaning tape. Then, very deliberately, she sat down on the floor about 2 meters from their fortress. The cubs watched her with intense suspicion. Lynette took one of the storage containers and flipped it upside down. Then she stacked another on top of it. The cubs' ears perked up. She added a 3rd container at an angle, creating a little wall. Oshira made a curious chirping sound. Lynette glanced at her, then slowly pushed one of the towels toward the cubs' fortress. Not close enough to threaten their space, but close enough to be an offering. For a long moment, nothing happened. Then Fexen, because of course it was Fexen, broke ranks and scampered over to investigate the towel. He sniffed it, batted it with one paw, then grabbed a corner with his teeth and started dragging it back toward the basket. Zulik chittered something that sounded like approval. Lynette hid her smile and pushed another towel forward. Then a container. Then another towel. Oshira was the next to venture out, her curiosity overriding her caution. She picked up the container in her mouth, struggling with its awkward shape, and hauled it back to the fortress. She tried to fit it into the existing structure, failed, tried again, then made a frustrated sound and started completely rearranging one wall to accommodate the new addition. Imolok watched from his post, torn between his duty to guard and his clear desire to join in. Finally, duty lost. He darted out, grabbed the cleaning tape and brought it back like he'd just secured vital resources from enemy territory. Zulik, seeing his siblings successfully expand their holdings, made a commanding bark and pointed at one of the remaining towels. Lynette pushed it closer. The cubs descended on the new materials with single-minded focus, incorporating everything into their growing fortress. The basket was now just the central keep, surrounded by walls of containers and ramparts of towels. The blanket had been repositioned to create an overhang. The whole thing was objectively ridiculous and structurally unsound, but the cubs treated it like they were building a castle that would stand for generations. "You're really committed to this, aren't you?" Lynette said quietly. Zulik looked at her, his golden eyes bright, and made a sound that was almost conversational. On impulse, Lynette pulled out one of the cleaning rags and waved it slightly. All 4 cubs froze, their predatory instincts kicking in, tracking the movement with perfect synchronization. She tossed the rag to the side. There was a moment of absolute stillness, and then all 4 cubs exploded into motion, scrambling over each other in a frantic race to reach the rag first. Fexen got there first purely by virtue of being small enough to dart under his siblings, but Zulik was faster and snatched it right out from under him. Oshira tried to steal it from Zulik, which turned into a brief tug-of-war until the rag tore in half. Imolok, seeing an opportunity, grabbed the other half and ran back to the fortress with his prize. Lynette couldn't help it. She laughed. The cubs all turned to look at her, various pieces of rag hanging from their mouths, their expressions so utterly baffled that she laughed harder. And then something shifted. Fexen, the smallest, tilted his head and made a sound that almost sounded like a laugh of his own, a chittering purr that made his whole body vibrate. The next 20 minutes passed in what could only be described as controlled chaos. Lynette had somehow become the unofficial supplier of fortress-building materials, handing over items from her cart, while the cubs incorporated them with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for species discovering fire for the first time. The structure had grown to genuinely impressive proportions, a hodgepodge tower of containers, towels, and cleaning supplies that defied both logic and gravity. Zulik had fully embraced his role as commanding officer, directing operations with barks and gestures that his siblings obeyed with varying degrees of accuracy. Oshira had created what appeared to be a multi-level design, with different sections serving different purposes, though what those purposes were remained a mystery to Lynette. Imolok took his guard duties seriously, occasionally doing perimeter checks that consisted of him walking in a tight circle around the fortress while trying to look intimidating. Fexen had discovered that if he climbed to the very top of the structure and jumped off, he could sort of glide for half a second before landing in an ungraceful heap, and he'd made this his entire personality for the past 10 minutes. Lynette was trying to explain the concept of structural integrity, using hand gestures, when Fexen's latest jump went wrong. He'd misjudged the distance, his back paw slipped on a towel, and he tumbled sideways off the fortress with a startled yelp. She moved without thinking, lunging forward and catching him before he hit the floor. The cub was surprisingly heavy for his size, all muscle under that fluffy exterior, and he made a distressed chirping sound as she turned him over to check for injuries. His front paw had caught on something during the fall, leaving a small scratch across the pad. Not serious, barely bleeding, but Fexen stared at it like he'd lost the entire limb. "You're okay," Lynette said softly, carrying him to her cart. "Let me just clean it up." She pulled out her basic first aid kit, the one she kept for minor injuries during maintenance work. A dab of antiseptic, a small bandage, and Fexen was patched up in under a minute. He stared at the bandage on his paw with wide eyes, then up at Lynette, then back at the bandage. Then he chirped, a soft sound, and pressed his head against her hand. Something in Lynette's chest did a weird flip. She'd never thought of herself as particularly maternal, had never really been around kids much, human or otherwise. But this little creature, this tiny ball of fluff and claws and mischief, was looking at her with such complete trust that she felt something fundamental shift in how she viewed this entire situation. "You're welcome," she whispered, carefully setting him down. Fexen immediately scampered back to the fortress, holding up his bandaged paw for his siblings to see. Zulik sniffed it carefully, then looked at Lynette with what might have been respect. Oshira made a concerned cooing sound and started grooming Fexen's ears. Even Imolok abandoned his post to investigate. Lynette was about to suggest they take a break from the jumping when the suite door hissed open. 3 Kilmoth guards entered in formation, their movements precise and military. They were larger than the ambassador, heavily muscled, wearing ceremonial armor that somehow made them look even more dangerous. The one in front, his fur a solid black with old scars crisscrossing his arms, stopped so abruptly that the two behind him nearly collided with his back. Uktar, the head of the Ambassador's security detail, stared at the scene before him like he'd just walked into a nightmare made manifest. His cubs, the offspring of the ambassador himself, were playing in what appeared to be a garbage heap constructed from cleaning supplies. A human, a maintenance worker, sat on the floor surrounded by them. The entire common area looked like a tornado had hit it, with furniture displaced, items scattered, and that ridiculous structure dominating the center of the room. "What?" Uktar said, his voice dangerously low. "Is happening here?" Lynette scrambled to her feet, her heart hammering. "I can explain. The cubs, they found the laundry basket, and I was told not to upset them, and security was delayed, so I kept them occupied, and—" "You," Uktar interrupted, taking a step forward, "allowed the ambassador's offspring to play with refuse?" "It's not refuse, it's cleaning equipment, and they seemed really happy with it, and I didn't think—" "Clearly." The other two guards moved to flank the fortress, clearly intending to dismantle it and extract the cubs. Zulik saw them coming, and his entire demeanor changed. The playful cub vanished, replaced by something that remembered he was supposed to be an apex predator. His ears flattened against his skull, his lips pulled back to show tiny but sharp fangs, and he let out a hiss that was considerably more convincing than his earlier attempts. Oshira joined him, positioning herself in front of the basket. Imilok, surprisingly, was the most aggressive, placing himself directly in the path of the approaching guards, with his fur standing on end. Even Fexen, bandaged paw and all, added his voice to the defensive chorus. The guards stopped, clearly not expecting resistance. "Stand down," Uktar ordered, and it took Lynette a second to realize he was talking to the cubs, not the guards. The cubs did not stand down. If anything, they became more aggressive, their hisses rising in pitch and volume. "They've claimed this territory," one of the other guards said, sounding mystified. "They won't yield." "They're cubs," Uktar growled. "They don't claim territory. They obey." But the cubs very clearly disagreed with that assessment. When one of the guards reached for a towel at the edge of the fortress, Zulik lunged forward and swiped at his hand, claws extended. The guard pulled back just in time, more from surprise than any real danger. "Don't touch it," Lynette said urgently. "They've been building it for almost an hour. It's important to them." Uktar turned to look at her, his luminous green eyes unreadable. "It is a pile of cleaning supplies. To you, maybe. To them, it's their fortress, their space. They've been working together, planning it, defending it. If you just tear it down, they'll—" Zulik chose that moment to leap in front of Lynette, placing himself between her and Uktar. The little cub barely came up to the guard's knee, but he stood his ground, tail lashing, making it absolutely clear that the human was under his protection now. Uktar stared at the cub. The cub stared back, unblinking. "This is unacceptable," Uktar said finally. "The ambassador must be informed immediately." He tapped a device on his wrist, speaking in rapid Kilmoth that Lynette's translation implant struggled to keep up with. She caught words like situation, cubs, and what might have been incompetence, though she wasn't sure if that was directed at her or the universe in general. The next 10 minutes were among the longest of Lynette's life. The guards maintained their positions, watchful but not moving. The cubs remained on high alert, ready to defend their fortress against all comers. Lynette stood awkwardly to the side, trying to figure out if she should start composing her resignation letter or her last will and testament. When the door opened again, Ambassador Ulakith filled the doorway. He was massive, easily the largest Kilmoth Lynette had ever seen. His fur a deep amber color that seemed to catch the light. His eyes, a brilliant gold, swept across the room, taking in every detail with the kind of tactical precision that came from decades of military command. He wore formal diplomatic robes that somehow made him look more dangerous, not less, the fabric unable to disguise the raw power underneath. Uktar immediately straightened. "Ambassador, I apologize for the disturbance. The situation is—" Ulakith held up one clawed hand, silencing him. He walked slowly into the suite, his gaze moving from the displaced furniture to the scattered supplies to the fortress itself. The cubs, recognizing their father, made excited chirping sounds, but didn't abandon their positions. Zulik stood a little taller, clearly proud of what they'd built. The ambassador stopped in front of the structure, towering over it, and for a long moment he simply stared. Then his shoulders started shaking. It took Lynette a second to realize he was laughing, a deep rumbling sound that seemed to come from somewhere in his chest. It built slowly, growing louder, until he threw his head back and laughed with genuine amusement that echoed through the suite. The guards looked at each other, confused. The cubs relaxed slightly, though they remained alert. Lynette felt her knees go weak with relief. "Forgive me," Ulakith said finally, his voice heavily accented but clear. He tapped something on his collar, and Lynette's translation implant synced properly. "I have not seen such a claiming den since I was a cub myself." "Claiming den?" Lynette repeated. The ambassador turned to her, and she had to resist the urge to take a step back. Up close, he was even more intimidating, but his eyes held warmth rather than threat. "It is instinct," he explained. "Young Kilmoth, when they feel safe, will claim small territories and defend them. It teaches cooperation, strategy, resource management, the foundation of pack behavior." He looked back at the fortress, his expression softening. "On our homeworld, cubs rarely survive long enough to engage in such behavior. The environment is too harsh. Claiming dens are something we know of from history, not something we see." "They've been working together all morning," Lynette said quietly. "Planning, building, defending. They're really good at it." Ulakith crouched down, bringing himself closer to eye level with the cubs. Zulik immediately launched into what sounded like a detailed report, gesturing at different parts of the fortress while his siblings chimed in with their own contributions. Fexen held up his bandaged paw, pointing at Lynette. The ambassador listened to all of it, nodding occasionally, making encouraging sounds. When they finished, he reached out and gently groomed Zulik's ears, then each of the other cubs in turn. Then he stood and faced Lynette. "You are the maintenance worker assigned to this suite?" "Yes, Ambassador." "Lynette. I was just supposed to do routine cleaning. But then the cubs found my laundry basket, and I was told not to upset them, so I just let them play." "You let them play," he repeated, as if testing the words. "You did not command them. You did not discipline them. You did not attempt to impose order. They weren't hurting anything, and they seemed so happy." Ulakith was quiet for a long moment, his gaze intense. "How long have you worked with Kilmoth cubs?" "I haven't. This is my first time. I've never even been around cubs before today." "Yet you understood instinctively what they needed." Lynette felt her face heat up. "I wouldn't say I understood anything, Ambassador. I didn't want them to be upset, and they were having fun. and it seemed wrong to take that away from them, just because I needed my basket back. Ulakith's ears swiveled forward. A gesture she was learning indicated interest or attention. You prioritize their happiness over your duties. Well, when you put it like that, it sounds bad. But I was still monitoring them, and nobody got hurt, except for Fexen's paw. And that was barely a scratch. And I made sure they weren't destroying anything valuable. Peace, the ambassador said, and there was something almost gentle in his tone. I am not criticizing. I am observing. He turned to Uktar, who still looked like he'd swallowed something unpleasant. Leave us. I will speak with Lynette alone. The head guard's jaw tightened. Ambassador, protocol requires... Protocol, Ulakith said softly, can be flexible. Leave us. Uktar clearly wanted to argue, but years of military discipline won out. He gestured to the other two guards, and they filed out of the suite, though not before Uktar shot Lynette a look that promised they would be having words later. The door closed, leaving Lynette alone with the ambassador and 4 cubs who'd gone back to examining their fortress, now that the immediate threat had passed. Ulakith moved to one of the Idhui couches and sat, gesturing for Lynette to do the same. She perched on the edge of the opposite couch, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Tell me, the ambassador said, what you did today. From the beginning. Leave nothing out. So she told him. About arriving to find the cubs alone, about the laundry basket, about their immediate claim on it, and her decision not to fight them for it, about bringing them materials, about watching them work together, about the game with the cleaning rag, about Fexen's fall and the bandage. She tried to be factual, professional, but she couldn't help smiling when she described Zulik's commanding presence or Oshira's architectural vision. Ulakith listened without interrupting, his expression unreadable. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, his gaze distant. On our homeworld, he said finally, survival is paramount. Cubs are born into violence. The weak do not live to see their first season. Those who survive must be hard, must be obedient, must be ready to fight from the moment they can walk. There is no room for play, no time for imagination, no space for joy. He looked at his cubs, who were now rebuilding a section of the fortress that had collapsed under Fexen's latest climbing attempt. I was raised this way. My mate was raised this way. Every Kilmoth for 1,000 generations has been raised this way. It is how we survived, how we endured, how we eventually conquered our world and reached for the stars. It sounds incredibly hard, Lynette said quietly. It was necessary, Ulakith corrected. Or so we believed. But our world has changed. We have allies now, trade partners, access to technology and resources that make survival less precarious. We have settlements on gentler worlds, stations like this where our cubs can grow without the constant threat of predators or starvation or territorial wars. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his massive hands clasped together. And yet, we continue to raise our cubs as if we are still fighting for survival every moment. We drill them in combat. We teach them discipline and obedience. We prepare them for a world that, for many of them, no longer exists. You're worried you're being too hard on them, Lynette said. I am worried, Ulakith said, that we are teaching them to be survivors when they should be learning to live. He gestured at the fortress. I have never seen my cubs like this. Iskahana and I, we follow the traditional methods. Structure, training, discipline. The cubs practice hunting techniques. They learn pack hierarchy. They memorize strategic formations. He paused. They do not build claiming dens. They do not play games. They do not laugh. But they did today, Lynette said. All of those things. Fexen has been laughing for the past hour. Because you let them, Ulakith said, and there was something in his voice she couldn't quite identify. Not anger, not accusation, something else. You gave them permission to be children. Lynette shook her head. I didn't give them permission, Ambassador. I just didn't stop them. That's not the same thing. Is it not? He stood, moving to the fortress, crouching down beside it. Zulik immediately came to him, and the ambassador ran his claws gently through his son's fur. Among my people, everything is either commanded or forbidden. There is little room for choice, especially for cubs. You did not command them to play, but you also did not forbid it. You created a space where they could choose for themselves what they wanted to do. They chose to build a fortress out of a laundry basket, Lynette said, and despite the serious conversation, she felt a smile tugging at her lips. Not exactly the most strategic decision. Ulakith's laugh was quieter this time, more contemplative. Perhaps that is exactly the point. Strategy can be taught. Obedience can be drilled. But creativity? Joy? The ability to see a basket and imagine a fortress? These things cannot be commanded. They must be discovered. He stood, and Fexen immediately climbed up his leg, clinging to his robes until Ulakith scooped him up. The little cub nuzzled against his father's chest, still holding up his bandaged paw like a badge of honor. You patched his injury, the ambassador observed. It was barely anything. Just a scratch. I couldn't just leave it. You could have. You could have called for medical assistance. You could have informed me and let me handle it. Instead, you treated him yourself, immediately, with gentleness. He stroked Fexen's head, and the cub's eyes drooped sleepily. Do you know what Iskahana and I would have done? Lynette shook her head. We would have told him to endure the pain, to learn from his mistake, to be more careful next time. Ulakith's voice was quiet. We would have turned an accident into a lesson, as we have been taught to do, as our parents did for us. There's nothing wrong with teaching cubs to learn from mistakes, Lynette said carefully. No, Ulakith agreed. But there is something wrong with never showing them comfort, with treating every moment as a test of survival, with forgetting that they are children first and warriors second, if they choose to be warriors at all. He set Fexen down gently, and the cubs scampered back to his siblings, who'd now somehow gotten themselves tangled together in the blanket and were rolling around in a fuzzy, giggling ball. The summit continues for 6 more days, Ulakith said, turning to face Lynette fully. Iskahana and I must attend most sessions. Ukhtar and the guards must maintain security protocols. The cubs cannot come to the sessions. They are too young, and there are too many species who would see them as either threats or targets. You need someone to watch them, Lynette said, seeing where this was going. I need someone who understands that they are cubs, not soldiers in training. Someone who will keep them safe, but also allow them to be themselves. Someone who sees a laundry basket and thinks, perhaps this can be a fortress for the day. Ambassador, I'm a maintenance worker. I'm not a caretaker. I don't have any training in... You kept 4 Kilmoth cubs entertained and safe for over an hour with nothing but cleaning supplies and intuition, Ulakith interrupted. You earned Zulik's respect, Osh'ira's trust, Imalok's loyalty, and Fexen's affection. You did not treat them as dangerous animals or as tiny adults. You treated them as exactly what they are, children who needed to play. He pulled out a small device, tapping something on the screen. I am authorizing a temporary reassignment. You will be compensated at 3 times your current rate. Your supervisor has already been notified. If you accept, you will spend the next 6 days with my cubs. You will keep them safe. You will keep them engaged. And you will continue doing exactly what you did today, letting them choose their own activities, within reason. Lynette's mind raced. 3 times her pay was significant, more than significant. But this was also the ambassador of a major galactic power, asking her to essentially babysit his children. If something went wrong, if one of them got seriously hurt, if there was an incident. She looked at the cubs. Zulik had finally extracted himself from the blanket pile and was attempting to reorganize his siblings for what looked like another project. Oshira was examining one of the storage containers, clearly planning something. Imolok had gone back to guard duty, though now he was guarding against his own siblings rather than external threats. Fexen was trying to eat the bandage on his paw. They were ridiculous. They were chaotic. They were absolutely adorable. And they'd spent the morning being creative, cooperative, and genuinely happy. "I'll do it," Lynette said, "on one condition." Ulakith's eyebrows rose slightly. "You are negotiating with an ambassador?" "I'm negotiating with a parent," Lynette corrected. "And my condition is that you don't expect me to turn them into perfect little soldiers. They're going to make messes. They're going to play games that don't have educational value. They're going to build forts out of inappropriate materials. And sometimes they're going to get minor scratches that I'll patch up without turning it into a life lesson." For a moment, the ambassador just stared at her. Then, slowly, a smile spread across his face, showing far too many teeth to be anything but intimidating. Except somehow, it wasn't. "Agreed," he said. "I would not want it any other way." He moved toward the door, then paused. "Lynette, one more thing. What you are doing for my cubs, teaching them that joy and strength are not opposites, that play and discipline can coexist, this is important. More important than you know. There are others among my people who think as I do, who question whether our old ways serve us well in this new galaxy. But change is difficult. Tradition is powerful. You're hoping that if your cubs turn out okay, it'll help convince others?" "I am hoping," Ulakith said quietly, "that my cubs will turn out happy. Everything else is secondary." He left, the door closing behind him with a soft hiss. Lynette sat alone on the couch, trying to process what had just happened. She'd come here to clean some rooms and change some sheets. She was leaving as the temporary caretaker for the ambassador's children, tasked with letting them play. Somehow, this had become the strangest day of her career. Zulik chirped at her, impatient, pointing at the fortress. Right, she had cubs to entertain. Lynette stood, brushing off her uniform, and walked over to the structure. "Okay, so what's the plan for the rest of the day? More building? Different game? Maybe we should actually test if this thing can withstand a siege." 4 pairs of luminous eyes lit up with interest. "That's what I thought," Lynette said, grinning. "But first, we're establishing some ground rules. No more jumping from high places without checking the landing zone, Fexen. No claiming furniture that's heavier than all of you combined, Zulik. No hoarding all the good building materials, Oshira. And Imolok, you're allowed to actually have fun instead of just guarding everyone else." The cubs stared at her. Then Fexen chirped, climbed to the top of the fortress, and jumped off anyway. This, Lynette thought as she lunged forward to catch him, was going to be a very long 6 days. And somehow, she was looking forward to every minute of it.